is a human being? What do human beings do? What does it mean to be happy, to live the good life for a human being? What is the body? What is the soul? What is anything, and how did it start? These are the kinds of questions that we are going to be dealing with through a little foray into Aristotle, who's very difficult and wrote a lot of stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make Aristotle not so difficult by making a YouTube video about him where I condense. This is Aristotle. That's what he sounded like. I'm going to condense the basic ideas of Aristotle. I'm going to distill them down. I'm going to do it from a particular perspective. One that I think is defensible to take. And that perspective is largely going to be through his ethics. Now, Aristotle's Ethics, which can be found in the book Nicomachean Ethics, the name of which is derived either from his father Nicomachus or his son Nicomachus. We don't know. Probably for his son, since his father was dead and could learn little about the art of character, which is what Ethica means, and it's, from what we know, likely Aristotle's coinage. So when we talk about ethics, we're talking about an invention of Aristotle's, which is interesting given the fact that Aristotle's account of ethics and the ethical really radically departs from a lot of our intuitive assumptions about what is ethical, about right and wrong, about obligation and moral duty. Now, Aristotle is concerned about these things, but he's concerned about them in a very unique way that challenges a lot of what we think about ethics, and a lot of what ethical philosophers themselves have brought to the table and sort of canonized as the principal philosophical ways of thinking through ethics. We also have, which I'll discuss the implications of this, but we also have this kind of way of conflating ethics with morals, with morality, and sometimes that's a workable shorthand. But in Aristotle's Ethics, the departure from morality is very important and central. So I talk about Aristotle through an ethical lens for that reason. It also seems to be the most important area of interest in Aristotle's many different intellectual pursuits. You know, he devoted a lot of time to studying biology, physics, law, rhetoric and poetics, logic, and as well as more traditional, as we know them now, philosophical concerns. But recall that back in Aristotle's time, we didn't really have the kind of clear distinction between where philosophy ends and where these other disciplines begin. Modern day psychology, modern day biology, modern day physics, all of these things originated in what was called philosophy. Remember, philosophy translates to the love of wisdom. So Aristotle had his fingers in multiple spinach pies, spanakopita. He was Greek. Actually, a little secret, He was actually Macedonian. So if you're one of those racist Greeks against Macedonians, this is a time to either turn off or turn on and expand your mind. Because Aristotle had a lot to say. And it's important to note, before we get into what his ethics was and what it meant, and how it radically departed from the moral thinking of his time, as well as ethical and moral thinking of our time throughout modern philosophy. It's important to note that all of these scientific pursuits bear upon Aristotle's ethics, his account of the good and the virtuous, in important ways. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and structure this around his ethics, around his intimately related and inextricable theory of the human, but in order to kind of make fruitful pathways into understanding the basic concepts of Aristotle's ethics and his theory of human nature, I'm going to have to dive a little bit, sink my teeth into some of these other areas. For instance, Aristotle's writing on the soul, which was considered his psychology, as well as the metaphysics and the physics, all three of which provide the kind of formal structures, as well as the physical constructs behind his ethics. What does that mean? Well, first, it's vitally important to note that Aristotle approached the question of ethics, the question of acting virtuously, is derived from facts about the world. It is not necessarily at all derived from ideal states of being, but rather from what Aristotle calls the function, or the telos, of the human being. Now, the telos is the end point. And a teleology, you'll often hear Aristotle's ethics referred to as a teleological ethics. Teleology means that you are striving to attain some fixed endpoint. You're climbing the mountain, trying to get at that peak. However, this for many people implies that Aristotle had a view of the human akin to sort of a perfectionism, this sort of almost godly state, this state of perfection, by virtue of attaining something out there, some otherworldliness, similar to the way that Plato talks about knowledge.
Knowledge is, for Plato, knowledge of the forms. That's how it's recollection. We recall the forms, the intelligible world, the forms. And the more we are able to recall these things outside of our embodied material existence, the more knowledgeable and wise we are.
Aristotle doesn't mean this when he talks about the end of humans. The end, of course, I don't mean the finale of humans, right? I mean the end product, the goal, if you will. Rather, all Aristotle means is when we've reached the telos, we have attained the full actuality of the human being itself. In other words, we are acting in accordance with what human beings essentially are. That's descriptive, not prescriptive. Right? He's not suggesting that human beings ought to be different than they are. and that his teleology will get us to some higher plane. He's only suggesting, or he's only saying, in the Nicomachean Ethics, as well as hinting at in other works, that when we reach this telos through virtuous life, which I'll get into in just a second, we are becoming who we are. Who we are exists. This is a crucial distinction in Aristotle that's going to come up again and again. There's the potential and the actual. All human beings, little caveat there, I'll get to that. But essentially, at least the doctrine goes, all human beings have, or the potential, to realize fully who they are vis-a-vis what human beings fundamentally by nature are. It's just that they need some nudging through teaching about virtues and the application of the knowledge of virtues to get there. And there involves a state of what he calls eudaimonia. Eudaimonia has been translated in different ways and construed in different ways. People have identified it with happiness. I prefer the construction of eudaimonia as flourishing. It's a kind of happiness that doesn't come as a reward for acting virtuously, but the state of being which we subjectively experience when we have fully realized ourselves through virtue is a state of flourishing. So what does it look like to act virtuously? I mean, when we talk about acting virtuously, one should act virtuously. That's a relatively uncontroversial thing, right? The problem is, what are virtues? What is virtuous and what is not? So Aristotle gives an account of the definition of virtue, and you'll see how it relates to his overall naturalistic idea about conforming to the human as the human is naturally. So, to act virtuously is to act according to a rational principle. Okay? This is what sets us apart from non-human animals and other life forms. So we are able to act according to a rational principle. Note that he says a rational principle. So there's a little bit of openness here. But here's the thing. We must recall that, or note that, Aristotle understands human beings as animals as well, right? He does not elevate us as some entity closer to God than to the animals of the earth. It's just that we have within us different capacities, and the chiefmost capacity for ethics, for Aristotle, is reason. But since we are like animals, and we are animals, Aristotle also, uniquely for ethical theories, admits in, or permits, encourages non-rational acting to be mixed in with our rationally guided actions. So this is where the famous popular idea of the so-called golden mean comes in. And by mean, I don't mean what you might think of as an average, right, in mathematics. I mean to say, for Aristotle, the mean is the midpoint between two undesirable poles, two undesirable ways of acting that are also opposite from one another. And I'll flesh that out in a second, but the reason why he outlines this is not because he believes in moderation as some independent principle. Rather, it's because by acting in the mean, and he also doesn't always, in all conditions, say that we must act according to the mean, but by acting in the mean, as a general rule, we are in the correct balance, the perfect balance between non-rational impulses, emotions, which he believes are natural and good in certain degrees, and our rational principles. So, a commonly cited example, and one that he spends a good deal of time on in the Nicomachean Ethics, is the example of courage in the battlefield, right? Regular citizens were frequently called, conscripted, if you will, into battle during wars in the classical world. And he talks about the mean. The mean is courage, right? The virtue of courage. How is this derived? Well, on one pole, you have recklessness, going into battle without any care for life and limb, which is of course undesirable. It is ignoble, it is unnatural to the human animal, right? And on the other pole, we have cowardice, shrinking away from, trying to evade what one's duties are to the state. And one's duties to the state, you might be thinking, this seems like an extrinsic principle. It doesn't seem, in other words, it doesn't seem internal to what we've been saying, internal to the principle of human functioning, the descriptive scientific principle of human functioning, around which Aristotle derives his theory of ethics. But this isn't quite true, at least on Aristotle's account. Because to serve the state is part of what it is to be human. Aristotle famously says in the Politics, which we'll get to a little bit, that man is by nature a political animal, a social animal at that. And so it is natural for Aristotle, just as he sees rationally to his own affairs, sees to the affairs of the state, of which he is but one part. Just because the emphasis in the ethics is on achieving virtues that conform to the actual reality of what human beings are, does not necessarily mean that human beings themselves cannot be part of something greater. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the complexities around that in a moment. As far as what's rational, for Aristotle, things are rational if they are done after deliberation, if they are chosen by the individual using reasons. That's it. So to use an example that Christine Korsgaard uses in one of her great essays on Aristotle, she talks about the example of spraying your neighbor down with a hose. Now, it is just as rational for Aristotle to spray your neighbor down with a hose because you believe that your neighbor has become the devil incarnate, as it is to spray your neighbor down with a hose because your neighbor is actually on fire. Both come after deliberation. They are the result of reasoning. And but it would be irrational, for example, to spray your neighbor down with a hose as a reflex because you were watering your hostas or whatever, and Shelley says, "Oi mate, what you watering hostas for? You don't need to do that. They don't need water." Shelby doesn't have much of a green thumb, but she startles you and you hose her down. You get her all wet. That is not rational, because that comes from an impulse, rather than from reasons. So there are good and bad reasons, which do, in a sense, correspond to a normative view of the good and bad exercise of rationality, the rational principle. And the degree to which the good and bad constitute a moral theory on Aristotle's part, in distinction from the kind of descriptive ethical theory that I'm talking about here is a matter of some debate. Regardless, because Aristotle founds all of these things on what he at least takes to be natural and scientific and logical research and reasons, in order to understand better the deliberative process of the human and that out of which the human is able to make choices, we're going to have to turn now to Aristotle's psychology, which is also something coined by Aristotle, as far as we know. Psychology for Aristotle was the study of the soul. Today we might call it the study of the psyche. But the two are identifiable for all intents and purposes, except for the small fact that Aristotle was, in his account of the soul, also rebutting some other accounts of the soul in a very different sense, particularly the soul that we've discussed from Plato. And this work is called De Anima. It's probably Aristotle's hardest and most convoluted work, but I'm going to try and condense it and make it easy for you. So we're going to talk about the soul. So, De Anima is a difficult and strange work of Aristotle's, but one can get a good deal out of it in terms of adding a kind of psychological substance to Aristotle's account of reasoning and deliberation, since reasoning and deliberation are the kind of markers of the rational principle that one must use in order to be virtuous, in order to be acting in a virtuous manner. But so recall that the psychology for Aristotle in De Anima is the study of the soul. And the book is translated as On the Soul. As far as the soul goes, the soul, as we saw in the last video, is central to Plato and is something that inhabits the body, is fundamentally separable from the body, and is that to which we ought to look. Plato says it clearly in the Phaedo that philosophers ought to despise life and love death, because in death, the eternal transcendent soul is able to interact directly with the intelligible realm, which is the world of forms. And since a philosopher naturally is after knowledge as her fundamental pursuit, it follows that she would want to unfetter herself from the body in Plato's conception of the body, which is sort of like a ball and chain we have to drag around with us, and that confuses and disorients us and points us away from true knowledge, which is only contained within the soul. Aristotle doesn't have that kind of understanding of the soul. And it's interesting because that understanding of the soul, of its permanence, that when you die, your soul remains, for anyone who believes in a soul, and this is generally emphasized in theology, Christian theology, for example, this is really kind of the meat of the concept of the soul, right? Is its transcendence, the way that it fundamentally transcends the body, and the way that the soul living on after the body. We talk all the time where people talk all the time, sort of woo-woo spiritually, people talk all the time of people leaving their body. And of course what they mean by that is that there is some fundamental you-ness that simply leaves the body. The body is incidental. In fact, it's almost like a prison for your soul, according to many popular accounts of the soul and many intuitions about what it is. Aristotle says, no, the soul and the body are a necessary unity. Meaning, when the body dies, it follows that the soul also dies. Every soul is unified with a particular person, so everyone has their own unique soul. However, that is not meant to say that the soul is the container of one's individuality, their inner self. One's individuality, for Aristotle, is better explained by the body. So, one way of thinking about that is that with our body, we act. Our actions, and this is essential to Aristotle's ethical theory and follows from it, I believe, our actions are our virtues. They're identifiable with each other. In other words, to exercise virtue is inextricable from action. It is always active. However, also recall the centrality of Aristotle's doctrine of potentiality and actuality. Now, in his account of the soul is not exactly potentiality, and it's not full actuality. Aristotle actually has 3 stages from potentiality or potential to actuality, the actual. And in the ethics, the actual corresponds to actually enacting virtues, which in turn corresponds to eudaimonia, flourishing, right? But he needs an account of the potential and the actual when it comes to the interior makeup of a human being, not simply at a mechanical level, but at a psychological level. So he needs an account of the actuality and potentiality and the move from one to the other as it relates to the soul. Now the soul, for Aristotle, is what he calls first actuality. Full potentiality is pure matter or pure form. And that might be a little bit suggestive, but I will flesh out what matter and form mean in just a moment. First actuality, which is also second potentiality. If you can keep these, I'll probably post a little timeline thing down here. First actuality is the soul, meaning necessarily the conjoinment of the body and the soul. And then for human beings, full actuality would consist of virtuous action in accordance with our specifically human rational principle. Full actuality is always a practice. It is always doing something. Potential is a kind of muck of things that could be but are not yet. So it goes from totally inert to existing, living, to totally active, is a way of looking at those 3. He also talks about the makeup of the soul. And for Aristotle, it's kind of like a food pyramid, right? In fact, the lowest rung on the food pyramid is the nutritive component of the soul, or what he calls department of the soul. So what's up with Aristotle and all this business talk with his forms, filling out all these forms with his departments? Stupid joke. The nutritive is the lowest rung of the soul, and it is the part of the soul that non-human animals, plants, and human animals all share. Next is perceptive, and then initiating movement. Those two, non-human animals and human animals, share, not plants. Plants can't perceive or initiate movement, at least according to Aristotle. Final and highest rung of the hierarchy of the soul is intelligence. Now, it's important to note that intelligence, as a part of the soul, is nothing when it isn't thinking. And it is the employment of this highest rung of the soul that allows us to deliberate and to construct and act according to a rational principle. So the soul is, for Aristotle, kind of a fleshing out of the reasons that we talk about when we talk about rationality consisting of acting upon reasons. You can act upon nutritive or appetitive reasons. This, for Aristotle, while it is a part of the human soul, and again, recall the courage example and the doctrine of the mean, Aristotle isn't saying that one ought to never act upon nutritive impulses, never to act upon maxims that come out of that part of the soul. Or perceptive. Of course you need the perceptive part of the soul, or else nothing would be intelligible and you would have no basis upon which you could deliberate and have reasons behind your actions. Couldn't be virtuous. Initiating movement. This is a key one, as I'll explain in a moment. So it isn't that human beings in their proper function only act according to the highest department of the soul. It's that human beings uniquely possess this department of the soul, and that is what we ought to have a mind towards activating, actualizing when we act. And when we use intelligence in our reasoning, we are acting according to a rational principle, and therefore we are acting virtuously. Okay, now to understand best how this all works together, then we're going to cycle back to the ethics and the virtues a little bit and talk finally about Aristotle's influence. But in order to get there, we're going to need to dive even a little bit deeper into Aristotle's account of the fabric of reality, of how there comes to be what there is. First of all, which means his metaphysics, and to a lesser degree his physics. First of all, Aristotle roundly rejects Plato's theory of the forms, and this is for reasons predictably related to his overall materialist, naturalistic disposition. Plato wants us to turn away from the world as the real world and towards some ineffable world of essences out there. Aristotle is firmly grounded within it, or at least he takes himself to be. So the first thing about Aristotle's rejection of Plato's forms is that he sort of inverts the idea of the forms. In other words, while Plato believed that men, individual men, exist only because there is a form out there of the general concept of man, and individual men derive their being from that form. Aristotle thought almost exactly the opposite, which is that it is only due to the existence of men that we can have any sort of concept of man in general. It is only because there are men who can be thought about, can be intelligible, can be analyzed scientifically, psychologically, etc., that we can form a general concept of man. The second is second rejection of the forms by Aristotle is something that Plato himself acknowledges in his very tedious but very interesting book, the Parmenides. You might recall Parmenides from the first video on Parmenides and Heraclitus. This is a dialogue where Socrates is talking to Parmenides. He calls it in this text the greatest difficulty, and that is, well, he means by that the greatest logical difficulty, the greatest sort of whole problem in his conception of the forms, which Aristotle takes up wholesale, and that's simply that the forms being necessarily outside of the things which they are meant to determine, cannot causally influence those things or anything in the world, because there's no mechanism that connects them. They're fundamentally disconnected from one another at a metaphysical level. We've talked about the potential and the actual, potentiality and actuality. And this is going to be a recurring theme in Plato's account of how things come to be. Okay? Which is a combination of his physics, his ideas about the physical world, the fundamental makeup of the physical world, and his metaphysics, his ideas about first principles of being, first principles of Genesis and creation, etc. So, the genesis of any given thing is looked at by Aristotle from two lenses, related lenses, but conceptually different. The first is through the causal process by which a thing comes to be. That is what he calls the four causes. And to illustrate this, I'm going to use the discipline standard example of the table. Philosophers, aside from furniture makers, I think, are the profession who reference tables the most. You're not likely to get through a philosophy seminar without your professor saying, take this table, for instance. Right? So, in keeping with that, we use a table. So, we have four causes, or better understood as four types of cause, that all go into the creation of something. There's the material cause, the matter that goes into a thing. In the case of the table, it's wood. So that's the material cause, wood. We have the formal cause, which is the input into the creation of something's existence that has to do with its form, in the ordinary sense, not in the Platonic sense. And for the table, the formal cause is its design, right? Then we have the efficient cause, which is the mechanism by which something is created, by which matter is joined to form. And that is, in the case of table, through carpentry. And then finally we have the final cause, which is, let's say it's a dining table, dining, right? So this is sort of interesting because this means that the final cause is also the end of a thing. In the same sense as how a virtuous life constitutes the end of a human being. So it is both describable as a cause, in that it is the reason for being part of the causal generation of a thing, and also a thing that is finally caused, the end point. It is both of these at once. And this is a very interesting identification, harmonization on the part of Aristotle, who is keen to identify things like passive and static principles with activity. It's just an interesting way of looking at it. So back to ethics for just a moment, and this is relevant to this. It is because human beings can fundamentally change themselves and objects. In other words, fundamentally generate new states of affairs, that they are this dual final cause and end. That is, if they fulfill the virtues proper to the human being. Thus, by Aristotle, human beings are called primary beings. But the second account of generation, the second type of account of how a thing is created, kind of complicates this a little bit. And we'll see why in a second. So the other account is linked, of course. They're meant to form a whole. All of this is a whole with an H. The material cause is known as matter or substrate. Remember, this account deals with the actual stuff of creation, the things that go into it, go into any given thing to make a thing what it is. So the material cause is matter or substrate. The formal cause is the form itself, the final cause, of course, of matter and form in an active sense, in a sense in which that combination is active or actual, right? Not potential. So matter, for Aristotle, which is why he also calls it substrate, is potential, pure potential, as is form. Form being the shape of a thing. Matter and form come together when matter takes on a shape. Right? So the problem with the idea of human beings as primary beings with this is, of course, what seems to be primary is the matter or the form. That's what seems to have what is often called ontological primacy. Put a definition up there.
Okay, Mr. Elliot, here's what I found. Chris Brinner, 2004, defines things which have ontological primacy as things that the world is in the first place made of, and that such other objects as may exist can be reduced to them. Break 226, emphasis in original. Is there anything else I can help you with today?
Here's how Aristotle deals with this, somewhat compellingly, or convincingly. Aristotle argues that primary things, sources of motion and change, and also, of course, at the same time, objects of our comprehension, must be then intelligible. Matter without form is unintelligible. Form, also, in keeping with his sort of materialistic, naturalistic view, is also unintelligible unless it is embodied in matter. That's a long way of explaining, starting with ethics and virtue, how Aristotle accounts for in naturalistic and psychological terms the existence of things, the existence of human beings, such that he is able to propose an ethics based on what he takes to be the fundamental nature of human beings. So to conclude, I want to talk a little bit about Aristotle's influence. Just briefly, Aristotle's influence was enormous. Thomas Aquinas, a philosopher I'm going to talk about in a couple of weeks, and himself one of the most influential, wide-ranging philosophers in history, refers to Aristotle simply as the philosopher. And this comes from a tradition in medieval philosophy, which will be kind of the next thing after the ancients, chronologically, where they really took up Aristotle's work. And this was sort of part historical accident, just the availability of his works, the discovery of his works. Plato's works were less available. And also scholasticism being a medieval way of doing philosophy that was based on a kind of rigorous pedagogical principle and was also rooted in Christian thought, but brought in ancient sources. Aristotle's sort of all-round knowledge fit well with that. But one particular interpretation and one particular influence interests me particularly, and that is Karl Marx. Karl Marx took up a version of Aristotle's virtue theory. How so? So, especially in the early to mid-period works of Marx, when he was still hadn't completely broken with Hegel, and we'll get to these figures, don't worry. But probably most of you know who Karl Marx was. Wrote the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, etc. Very briefly, Marx had this idea of alienation. And in his later works, that's in his earlier works, in his later works, he talks more specifically about the exploitation of labor value, so the exploitation of the commodity of my ability to work. Anyway, in both cases, what's at stake is the human, essentially, to use a cliche, being a cog in a machine that generates profits, and at the same time strips the laborer of any of the actual fruits of their labor, right? And so, to the extent that he was interested in ethics and that his philosophy did have an ethical thrust, it was of this Aristotelian kind. Because what is wrong in capitalism for Marx is that alienation offends against some basic principle of who we are as people, who we are meant to be as human beings, right? And this is principally in his early work. I argue that it's also present in his later work, but we'll get there when we get to Marx. And this is a debate that we can certainly have. If you join the Patreon, you'll get access to the Discord chat, and you can own me if you like. You can totally wreck me. But the idea in Marx is that man is a socially creative, free associating, socially productive animal, right? And that his reification into a specific task, into a specific repetitive instrumental task, is bad to the extent that it goes against his nature, right? He writes in the German ideology, written in 1945 with Friedrich Engels. He writes that that in a communist society, a man could, this is a paraphrase, a man could fish in the morning, bake in the afternoon, and do criticism in the evening without ever becoming a fisher, a baker, or a critic. And this, to him, represented what human beings essentially are, the state in which they're meant to find themselves. So that's one particularly captivating approach to revival of Aristotle. And Marx writes about Aristotle directly. And I think the evidence of the Aristotelian influence is preponderant, because Marx is in favor of and opposed to things, societies, states of affairs, to the extent that they do or do not conform to what he believes to be human nature. Now, human nature is also, now I'm getting too into the weeds, but human nature is also contingent for Marx. It changes. But there is a sort of what Wittgenstein will call a family resemblance between, throughout all of the changes in the nature of the human, that history sort of inflicts on the human. And Marx's materialist, descriptive account of ethics is very much of a piece with Aristotle's. And so I think that in closing, I think that there's a lot politically that one can do with Aristotle's ethics. And that the fact that he doesn't appeal to some sort of external ought, some sort of moral law, can actually be good and could lead to good outcomes for policy, for society, if we are thinking in terms of a fruitful and just and comprehensive understanding of what the human is. So Aristotle gives us sort of the formula, the formal structure, which is actions being virtuous to the extent that they do or do not promote human flourishing, eudaimonia, and human flourishing is being in the state of affairs that is proper to the human being. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. Very briefly, there should be another video coming up on the Patreon. That'll be the last public Patreon video before everything is paywalled. Please join the Patreon. If you like this video, if you think you could theoretically like future videos, please consider joining the Patreon. I have 3 series, which I talk about more in depth in the video that I'm going to be posting to the Patreon for the public. I have 3 series, one on philosophy in film and television, where I try and do that intersection of topics in a way that isn't shitty and hackneyed, which you see often, not always, but often on YouTube channels. Also going to be having a series on Western Marxism. It's a particular interest of mine. And even if you don't consider yourself a Marxist, which I imagine many of you do not, the history of Western Marxism is a history of some very, very fascinating ethical and political philosophies all on their own. I'm also going to be doing the baddies, not baddies as in IG hoes, Instagram hoes, but baddies in the sense of the Mitchell and Webb show sketch that's become a meme, where Mark's character is they're Nazis and they have the Totenkopf and they have the swastika, and he's looking at the Totenkopf, that's the skull thing, on Webb's character, and he's like, "Are we the baddies? Are we the bad ones?" Like realizing that maybe all the scary imagery means that they're actually the bad guys. So that'll be a series about people whose philosophy was very politically and ethically reactionary, but who are considered philosophers nonetheless. Some of them direct advisors to fascist governments like in Italy and in Nazi Germany. Some of them just had very, very bad consequences of the application of their philosophy throughout history. These videos will start dropping next week. In 2 weeks, I hope I pray there will be a quorum of Patreon followers that we can start doing our reading group, which will convene on the Discord. Whenever you become a patron, you get invited to the Discord. There's all sorts of stuff that will be going down on the Discord. These videos I'm talking about that are part of these series will be 15-20 minutes each, short little breakdowns for patrons only, and they'll be a lot of fun. So I hoped you enjoyed, I hoped, and I still hope you enjoyed this little breakdown of the sort of basics, the basic takeaways of Aristotle's thought. And in the link, I'll post some secondary readings, some articles that can also help you if you're really interested in Plato. And that's something I'm going to be doing henceforth. So if Plato really interests you and you're really piqued by some of these ideas, I'll post some cool readings. Anyway, thanks for viewing and listening. Love you guys as always.
Gazing quite vacantly into space one day, sitting up in my bed, surrounded by a few Sunday papers and their color supplements, all of them superficially interesting, happily unaware that somewhere somebody was aware that somewhere somebody was awake and well, undisturbed, living on. Dancing quite speedily through assortments of horrible illustrations of atrocities and apologies of editors, but they felt it was necessary for people to see the picture.